Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to Final Trade. So WOTC is getting sued. I have seen, a lot of videos about it on YouTube. I've watched a bunch of them over the last couple of days. And, a lot of them have really, really bad takes on the lawsuit, on what it means, on what it's about, etc. And so being the guy who is no fun at parties, the guy who always brings receipt, who brings data, and who builds models for everything, I thought, how can we resolve some of this bad information that's out there? How can we figure out what this is really about? Because most people are going out and they're just making a reaction video based on having read an article from a journalist who read someone else's article, who got into the circular reporting cycle and has not read the actual complaint. And so here at Final Trade, what we're going to do is we're going to sit down and we're going to read the actual complaint, all 72 pages of it. So buckle up. Now, this is going to be mostly in what I would call a podcast format. You don't really need to watch. So if you have a video game you want to play, you need to do some dishes, walk the dog, whatever else you've got to do, you probably don't need to watch all of the video on this. You can just listen and get probably 95 or 100% of it. Now, before we dive into this, a little bit of background. I am not a lawyer. For about the last 15 years, I have been interested in a lot of different types of legal cases, and I have read scores and scores and scores of complaints and judgments and court rulings and all kinds of filings from lawyers. And so I have a hobbyist background of reading these things over the last 15 years on all kinds of different subjects. So this is not my first time going through a legal filing and reading it, trying to figure out what is going on here. Now, before we get into the filing, I want to go over some of the bad takes that we see out there on YouTube and what is wrong with them. So I have the list of bad takes. So the first bad take we see a lot: collectors are suing because they lost money. No, the two gentlemen who are the plaintiffs in this case, they are not collectors. They are Hasbro shareholders. They do use as one pillar in their argument that collectors have lost value of their collections, but it is a pillar along the road of building up what their actual argument is. This lawsuit is not suing on behalf of collectors or because of collectors or for collectors or in response to collection values moving any which way. So if you've heard someone say that the lawsuit is from a couple of collectors who are suing because they lost money, no, it's not. Those people did not read the 72-page filing like I did already a couple of times and like I'm going to go through with you. So the second bad take I'm seeing a lot: WOTC is being investigated. Nope. This civil action may get to the point, if it survives motions to dismiss, it may get to the point where you go through discovery. And at that point, a whole bunch of people, the defendants, and probably a lot of other people, will be subject to depositions. You will have requests for WOTC internal emails, meeting minutes, presentations, all kinds of other things, at which point you will get all kinds of information, and the plaintiffs will do their own investigation of what happened inside the company relative to the arguments and the complaint being made here. But that does not mean that the, say, Justice Department or the Rhode Island Attorney General or anyone else is going out from the government and investigating WOTC right now. This is a civil action. It alleges criminal activity, but this is a civil action, and what would have to happen is there would have to be some kind of prosecutor somewhere in the U.S. who had jurisdiction, who said, I think this rises to the level of criminal conduct and serves enough of a useful law enforcement purpose to pursue, and then they would start a criminal investigation of what went on. But as it stands right now, no, WOTC is not being investigated, and if this goes to the discovery phase, where you're allowed to go and start requesting things you want from the defendants, information you want them to supply, then yes, that will, in a way, be an investigation. third bad take that I see, they are suing over Magic 30. No, they are not suing over Magic 30. Magic 30 is mentioned in the lawsuit, and so the low information journalists who are going to go and maybe thumb through this for a half second and then write an article with the help of AI, they might have seen Magic 30 mentioned in there and said, oh boy, this is about Magic 30. No, not really. Magic 30 is simply another one of those pillars that the plaintiffs are using in the formation of their argument as they build up an argument towards what they claim the wrongdoing is. The next bad take you see a lot. They're suing over using Magic's profit to support Hasbro, and man, I saw this one a bunch of times as I was doing searches on the internet, and, invariably Google will say, hey, go look at this Reddit thread, which is like, God, that's a crime in itself, Google thinking you're going to learn anything from Reddit. But a lot of people on Reddit seem to think that this is a lawsuit over Hasbro using the profit that it makes from Magic to support the rest of the company. No. Vaguely, there's an argument that the plaintiffs make that Hasbro managed Magic in such a way to make up for revenues that did not materialize in the rest of the company. But again, it's a minor pillar on the way of building up their entire argument. And I will show you in a minute what their argument really is. It is, we'll get there. So the next bad take we're seeing out there on YouTube, they're suing over Universes Beyond. Nope, Universes Beyond is not even mentioned in the lawsuit. The period that the lawsuit attests that the wrongdoing took place in was something like August of 2021 to September of 2023. You remember in that time we had the release of Lord of the Rings. We had already had Warhammer 40K come out. We were about to get Doctor Who. So there were Universes Beyond products in that time period, but the lawsuit does not hinge on Universes Beyond at all. And it does not make a distinction between Universes Beyond products and Universes Within products. That is no part of the argument. So the next bad take we see, Chris Cox is in trouble. Again, no, this is, like I said, a civil lawsuit. This is not a criminal complaint. And let's say 4-5 years down the line, this lawsuit finally gets in front of a jury. The jury deliberates for 3 minutes, and they eventually come back and they say, you know what, these two gentlemen and the plaintiffs, they were 100% right. Hasbro was 100% wrong. We affirm everything that the plaintiffs claimed Hasbro did wrong. We say that they did it all, and they award the plaintiffs everything they want. Even in that case, no, Chris Cox is not going to jail. No, Chris Cox will not be out one penny because executives at large corporations are indemnified by insurance policies that protect them in just these kind of cases. They use money from the company to buy insurance to protect themselves from the lawsuits that will happen when they do things that are detrimental to the company. So no, Chris Cox is not in any kind of trouble over any of this under any possible future outcome. And the last, you already saw the teaser, something will change. No, nothing is going to change at WOTC over this. The plaintiffs are not asking for significant changes that would change Magic's trajectory at all. So we as TCG investors, specifically here at Final Trade, or more generally as players of Magic, collectors, and enjoyers of the game, nothing is going to change for us based on the outcome of this lawsuit. Now, you might be able to make a claim that very, very, very far down the line, if everything went as well as possible, and Chris Cox and the rest of the defendants are all found to have been at fault in this lawsuit, then, some of them might have their career at WOTC cut short a little bit. And then the opportunity for future change might materialize a little sooner. But man, you are grasping at straws if that's what you're going for. Okay, so what is the argument that these two plaintiffs are making in this case? So the argument is that Magic has a secondary market. Okay, now I think that is not exactly controversial. and saying we have a secondary market. Most people understand Magic has a secondary market. Lots of Timmies do not like the idea that there is a secondary market and all game pieces are not 2 cents each, but then for some reason they also get mad when they want to trade in their collection and it's worthless. So, you know, you can't have it both ways, but they attempt to do so anyway. So the plaintiffs first start off essentially the argument being grounded as Magic has a secondary market. Okay. What's the second part of the argument as we construct this logical chain that eventually gets up to the wrongdoing that they say has happened? A Magic customer's collection has value. Okay, yeah. I mean, I would say that's not controversial, but again, you know, people make their entire YouTube channels screaming and cussing at the camera and waving their arms around, being mad that cards have value. But yeah, because there is a secondary market, which is undeniable, a Magic customer's collection has value. Hasbro is making too many new Magic sets. Now, okay, we got to reach deep here. We have to realize this is beginning another chain. So what we've done is we've gone from Magic has a secondary market, and that market makes a customer's collection have value. And now we're starting a separate set of logic here, and we're saying Hasbro is making too many Magic sets. Now, we're going to go down and we're going to do some things that come out of that, and then we're going to merge these arguments together here in a minute. Next thing, those sets contain reprints of valuable cards. I think this is probably pretty uncontroversial. Also, most of us realize that WOTC likes to cash in its reprint equity by reprinting valuable cards. Those reprints lower the value of customers' collections. Again, you know, there are some people who don't understand prices or where prices come from, but in my eyes, this is another one of those pretty uncontroversial statements that when you reprint a card, it lowers the value of all the other copies of it that previously existed in customers' collections. Falling collection values erode consumer confidence. Yes, because people like to think that this hobby that they've spent thousands and thousands of dollars on at least leaves them with a collection that's worth some fraction of the amount of money they've put into it. And very rarely, some people's collections exceed the value of the money that they've put into it. So if you have falling collection values, that erodes consumer confidence in Magic as a product. Unhappy consumers will buy less Magic. Again, this is something that I think is pretty uncontroversial. I think most people agree that when folks get mad at Magic, they buy less of it. I mean, generally, yeah. Lower sales will decrease the stock price. Again, not very hard to see the logical chain moving on here, that if the sales go down because the consumers are unhappy, because their collections are losing value, because there's too many reprints of the valuable cards, then the stock price will go down. Defendants knowingly lied about the overproduction, and defendants are responsible for the lower stock price and other damage as a consequence of that overproduction. Now, like I said, I've been reading legal arguments and lawsuits and court decisions and all kinds of things like that for about 15 years now, just as a kind of perverse hobby that I have. And typically, you want your argument to be much more concise, direct, and simple than this. This is one of the most convoluted and complicated arguments I've ever seen put forward in a lawsuit. It's not that it can't work, it's that the more abstract and difficult it is for the judge and or jurors to understand what exactly you're arguing, the less chance you're going to convince them that you are correct. And so typically what you would like to see is something like, you know, officer made contact with person did thing, officer arrested him, and then we claim that thing did or did not happen. And you have a much shorter chain of argument, one that does not rely on setting up this many things in order to claim that this harm has been done and that damages should be forthcoming. So let's get into the actual complaint. And so it starts off simply by naming the plaintiffs and naming all of the defendants, which are, of course, Chris Cox and Cynthia Williams, and then a bunch of other folks on the board of Hasbro. So it says that the defendants, together with Hasbro, And they're suing for breaches of their fiduciary duty as directors and or officers of Hasbro, unjust enrichment, waste of corporate assets, gross mismanagement, abuse of control, for violations of the Security Exchange Act of 1934, and against defendants Cox and Williams for contribution under sections 10B and 21D of the Exchange Act. Okay? And so they go in and basically say, here are the high-level things that we're suing for, and then we'll fill in the details down below. Now, nature of the action, this is a shareholder derivative action. Okay, see, this is coming from shareholders. This is not collectors who are angry that their collections are worth less. This is a shareholder derivative action that seeks to remedy wrongdoing committed by Hasbro's current and or former directors and officers from September 16th, 2021 through October 26, 2023, both dates included, further known as the relevant period. So just to get our heads in the right space there, let's remember that September 16th, 2021, that was probably sometime after Modern Horizons 2 released, before Adventures in the Forgotten Realms released. And then October of 23, golly, that was after Lord of the Rings and before Dominaria United? Am I in the right year? No, I'm not. Lost Caverns of Ixalan. That's it. Yeah, Wilds of Eldraine, Lost Caverns of Ixalan. It was that period in Standard. Hasbro's a Rhode Island corporation. Okay, we don't need that kind of background here for our discussion. Particularly in recent years, Magic the Gathering has become one of the company's most important lines of products. Magic is a popular card game that notably features rare cards highly sought after by collectors. Such cards may fetch upwards of thousands of dollars on the secondary market. So see, he's beginning to build that argument. There is a secondary market. The cards have value, therefore collections have value, therefore overprinting will reduce that value. It will erode sentiment, which will reduce buying, which will affect the stock price, and other harm. Given the nature of the secondary market, the rate at which new Magic card sets are printed and sold directly impacts the value of existing Magic cards to collectors. As such, overprinting of new sets would reduce the value of existing sets. Now, I'm going to go ahead and inject right here. A problem that this filing has is that they kind of conflate this idea of too many sets versus too much printing. And many, many times, in fact, the majority of the times that they mention either of those in this complaint, they talk about it as too many sets, okay? They don't specifically try to quantify overprinting, but they do sometimes mention the problem as overprinting, but then it's not clear if they mean overprinting as in too many cards, or something that they sometimes use, the words overprinting of sets, which is confusing because you can't tell if it means, again, too many sets or too many cards. And so they did a very poor job of being explicit and consistent on which one of these they're talking about. So, although analysts and investors consistently inquired as to whether the company was in fact overprinting Magic sets, the individual defendants repeatedly denied such speculation. And this is important. The first time I read through this, I kind of said, okay, but where's the meat? And the plaintiffs are establishing that this problem was brought up to them many times during the relevant period in conference calls and the like, and the defendants kind of shrugged it off and said, no, we are not overprinting. But then they'll show through other means that the defendants knew they were overprinting or producing too many sets. Rather, the individual defendants claimed that the company printed Magic sets according to its segmentation strategy, which they'll go over here in a bit. According to the strategy, new Magic sets were to be printed to meet demand from new customer segments. For instance, September 16th of 21, the first day of the relevant period, the company held an investor call. During the call, defendant Cox stated that Magic was, quote, not trying to build one product for one customer that has to buy everything, because the real growth and the real driver for us has been thinking about things on a segmented basis. The truth began to emerge November 14th, 2022, when Bank of America issued a report that the company had been overprinting Magic sets and risked damaging the value of Magic's brand. Okay, there we are. We're making some of those logical links in between overprinting and eventually getting to the point where people spend less. It damages the brand. People don't want to buy it. They spend less money. On this news, the company's stock price fell 9.9% to close at this value. Nonetheless, individual defendants continued to downplay the negative implications of its printing strategy as it pertained to Magic products. For instance, December 8th, 2022, the company hosted a special call with investors. The special call, was this the fireside chat? I can't remember. I think this was the fireside chat, that comical event. During the call, Defendant Williams stated that our growth has come from monetizing more player segments and not just from increasing the spend of the same core set of players, and our product release schedule really reflects that. Now, the argument that she was making at the time right there, unrehearsed on that call, was that we are creating these additional segments. We have basically arena and casual players and serious players and collectors, and we are trying to create products for each of those segments in order to increase sales and revenue. The truth continued to emerge January 26, 2023, when the company issued a press release announcing its results for the fourth quarter. Wizards segment had fallen significantly short of the company's guidance for the year-over-year fourth quarter revenue growth. Now, and I don't know if this is just shoddy production of this complaint by the lawyers, or are they intentionally trying to be vague here? They fell significantly short of the company's guidance for year-over-year fourth quarter revenue growth. So did the revenue still grow? It just didn't grow as much as they had guided. I wish they had put some numbers in here, but I suspect they intentionally left them out because it wasn't as dramatic as they would have expected. And I will show you a couple examples of that are kind of silly coming up. So, press release further noted that the company would eliminate 15% of its workforce and the COO would be departing. On this news, the stock fell again, 8.1%. Nonetheless, individual defendants continued to downplay the consequences of its protocols for printing Magic products. For instance, April 27, 2023, the company hosted an earnings call to discuss financial results of the first quarter of 23 with investors and analysts. During the call, Defendants Cox stated that, quote, our owned inventory is up a bit, but most of that has to do with kind of the nature of Wizards production. Okay. And this is another one of those things where it's like, did the lawyers who drafted this complaint kind of leave that ambiguous on purpose? Or did they not understand or what? Because I look at this and coming from my background, I always want everything to be explicit. You know, when we would go into a flight test for, let's say, a launch vehicle, we would say, okay, we need to make sure we explicitly know everything and that everyone in the control room is aware of everything that's going on. And so we would never word something like this. And so it always makes me wonder, are they writing uncarefully? Or are they intentionally writing in a vague way? Because the reality is our owned inventory is up a bit, but most of that has to do with kind of the nature of Wizards production. Well, yes, it's the timing of printing versus distributing. And typically when you get Magic products, they will have been printed 2 to 3-ish months before that if it's a new release product. And so you can have certain periods of time if WOTC has set release dates in such a way, and then you hit a quarterly report date that they have to report very high inventory because they're sitting on product that they've not yet shipped to distributors. So those things can be very innocuous. It's just part of the normal business cycle, and you've taken a snapshot of their inventory picture right then at a point in time, and it may or may not look favorable to the company. And so I think that's what Chris Cox is saying is that, hey, yeah, of course our inventory is up, but it has to do with how we produce Magic and then how we distribute it, you know. And there are cases, even just in the normal course of Magic, where they will print and they'll hold back some of the product and they'll release it as a second wave a little later or a lot later or whatever. So sometimes they do sit on product for a long period of time. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're overprinting. So it's hard to tell. So the plaintiffs claim the truth finally emerged October 26, 2023. Before the market opened, Hasbro issued a press release, disappointing financial results. The Q3 2023 press release reported that the company had reduced owned inventory by 27%, but further noted that consumer products inventory had decreased by 34%. During an earnings call held the same day, the individual defendants stated that the, quote, reduction in total owned inventory was primarily driven by the reduction in non-Wizards inventory. Okay. This is another one of those things where I look at it as with an engineering background and I start to tease apart what these data mean. What do these statements imply? Okay, so the total owned inventory went down by 27%. Consumer products inventories went down by 34%. Okay, so that has to mean that Wizards inventory shrunk by less than 27% because Wizards plus consumer products combined into the overall. Okay, so primarily driven by reduction in non-Wizards. So apparently they're still holding a lot of WOTC inventory. That's the implication that the plaintiffs want you to get. But I think it's not obvious, especially if we think back to the time period here, 2023, and by Q3 of 2023, and late into the year, so we're talking beginning of October 2023, we know from the past, from the data we've gathered here at Final Trade, that WOTC had already slashed print runs at the beginning of 2023. Now, 2023 was also the peak year for the number of major releases with 9. So they were printing less of each set, and then they were releasing more sets. What does that tell us about whether their inventory should have grown or shrank? Nothing, because we don't know the quantity by which the print runs shrunk. We know they shrunk. We've seen that in the data from 2023, the beginning of it onwards. We see that the print run shrunk, but we don't know how much. We do know that the number of major releases in 2023 was 9. So primarily driven by reduction in non-Wizards inventory, they could or could not have been holding a lot more WOTC inventory. It's very difficult to understand these things, and I know that the plaintiffs are limited because they have not gone through the discovery process yet. Maybe that's part of why this reads this way, why it doesn't seem that careful. So then the stock price went down some more. During the relevant period, the individual defendants in breach of their fiduciary duties owed to Hasbro willfully and recklessly made and or caused the company to make false and misleading statements. Specifically, individual defendants willfully or recklessly made and or caused the company to make false and misleading statements that failed to disclose inter alia that Hasbro's strategy with regard to printing Magic cards was not as carefully thought out as portrayed. 2, the company was in fact printing a volume of Magic sets which exceeded consumer demand. 3, the company's inventory allocation management was problematic as it pertained to the company's printing strategy for Magic. And 4, the company was overloading the market with Magic sets to generate revenue and to offset shortfalls within the company. And that's where the bad take that this lawsuit is about that comes from, is from these kind of lines that will be sprinkled again and again throughout. It is not the major thrust of the lawsuit that WOTC generated money with Magic and used that to cover losses in the rest of the company. That's just what companies do. I mean, Final Trade has activities that make a lot of money, activities that make little money, activities that make no money, and a couple of activities that lose money that are vital to the company. And so you use the profitable things to cover everything else, and you hope to get an average profit that makes the entire business worthwhile. Let's see. As a result of the company's overprinting of Magic sets, existing Magic cards were devalued. The company failed to maintain internal controls. As a result, the public statements were materially false. And then the individual defendants failed to correct and or cause the company to fail to correct those false or misleading statements. So he's trying to attribute responsibility here. The company has been substantially damaged as a result. And the individual defendants caused the company substantial harm by causing it to repurchase its own shares at artificially inflated prices. In total, the company spent an aggregate of approximately $125 million to purchase approximately 1.4 million shares of its own common stock at artificially inflated prices from April 22 to July 22. In total, this caused the company to overpay for repurchases of its own stock by approximately $55.9 million. Now, the place where they get that number is they go to the end of the relevant period, September 2023, when the stock is at a much lower price, and they say, well, they could have just bought then instead, and they would have saved $55 million. And so that's what that argument is. In light of their misconduct, let's see, they are, yes, this is where they bring in another lawsuit. So there's a class action lawsuit going on right now that's separate from this. And basically, one of the things I thought when I finished reading this was that the entire point of this lawsuit is these plaintiffs believe WOTC will lose the class action lawsuit, and they're basically trying to unload the financial responsibility of that lawsuit loss onto the defendants here and get it off of Hasbro's back. So he's going to talk about that lawsuit. Let's see, substantially damaged as a result of the individual defendants knowing or highly reckless breaches of fiduciary duty and other misconduct. Yeah, so they have liability in the securities class action. They're being beholden to each other, their longstanding business and personal relationships with each other, and of their not being disinterested or independent directors. A majority of the board cannot consider a demand to commence litigation against themselves and other individual defendants on behalf of the company. So normally what you might do is you would come to the board and you would say, hey, Hasbro, you should sue, some guy who's not even related to Hasbro, right? You might be able to come to the board and convince the board to do that. But in this case, the plaintiff is saying, I think the people who need to be sued are most of the board and then a bunch of other directors at the company who are named in this lawsuit. And so he's starting to establish the argument that because of that, the board cannot conduct this lawsuit. It has to be conducted by us as shareholders. Okay, this next section of jurisdiction and venue is not that important. It's just saying that the Rhode Island District Court is the right place to do this for a bunch of reasons. And then we start talking about the parties to the lawsuit, the plaintiffs, Hasbro, defendant Cox, defendant Williams, and then all these other people who are named. And there are a bunch of other board members and directors and other people. So it's naming all of these as folks who knew or should have known that these things were going on. Now, relevant non-parties, that means people who are important to the story but are not plaintiffs or defendants. And it goes through these former employees who are named as FE1 through, I believe, FE7. And it talks about who they were, previously served as Wizards vice president. And let's see, it talks about their responsibilities at the company and what kind of information they were privy to. Now, we will get to the specific allegations made by these people a little later on and the things that they're contributing to this lawsuit. Again, these people are not party to the lawsuit, but they potentially have information. And in the separate class action lawsuit, some of these people have been what do you call it? Depositioned? I don't know. What's the past tense form of deposition? So fiduciary duties of the individual defendants. And so it goes through what their duties are to make sure that the company is competent, that things are managed well, and sets out specifically what Chris Cox and Cynthia Williams and the rest of the board and these directors were supposed to have done. Okay, and so we get down here as senior executive officers and directors of a publicly traded company whose common stock was registered with the SEC pursuant to the Exchange Act and traded on the NASDAQ. Really? Hasbro is traded on the NASDAQ and not the New York Stock Exchange? That's weird. The individual defendants had a duty to prevent and not to affect the dissemination of inaccurate or untruthful information with respect to the company's financial condition, performance, growth, operations, financial statements, business, products, management, earnings, internal controls, and present and future business prospects, including the dissemination of false information regarding the company's business, prospects, operations, and had a duty to cause the company to disclose in its regulatory filings with the SEC all those facts described in this complaint that it failed to disclose, so that the market price of the company's stock would be based upon truthful and accurate information. And so a lot of this is that they did not admit that they were printing too many magic cards. When people in conference calls asked them directly about the risk of printing too many cards and releasing too many sets, they would wave it off. And so that would eventually negatively affect the market price of the company's common stock because they were not making truthful statements about the overprinting. And so as we get further into this, you'll see that there is claimed evidence or claims themselves that the defendants all knew that they were overprinting and lied during the conference calls. To discharge their duties, the officers and directors of Hasbro were required to exercise reasonable and prudent supervision over the management policies, practices, and internal controls of the company. So it goes through what their responsibilities were. Why did I make this note here? Let's find out. Conduct the affairs of the company in an efficient, business-like manner so as to make it possible to provide the highest quality performance of its business, to avoid wasting the company's assets, and to maximize the value of the company's stocks. Yes. So it's part of this complaint that confuses me. And again, I'd be interested to hear your assessment of it, but he complains that the stock price was too high, and so when they repurchased shares, they paid too much. And then he says that their responsibility is to maximize the value of the company's stock. And so this is one of those things where it's like, well, if you had asked Craig to proofread this complaint before you filed it, I would have highlighted this and made a rude comment about this exact thing. And so I don't understand how this got past proofreading. I just wonder if at some law firms, like there's not an opt for or a red team or whatever you would have that goes through and antagonistically looks at all your filings before you file them. Because this is kind of a weak argument to make when you also make the argument that the stock price was too high and they did buybacks, and so they paid too much for the buybacks. So it goes through other things they were supposed to have done, and it starts laying down the accusations of what they say that the defendants, Cox and Williams, and the rest did. Hasbro's code of conduct, it goes through this and it lays down what the corporate code of conduct is and what the audit committee's charter is so that it can say, look, these people should have known better. This is what internally they had agreed to do as a company, and they obviously weren't doing it because here we are. So individual defendants' misconduct, background on Hasbro, and it talks about the company and drills down into Wizards of the Coast and then into Magic. Let's see. Magic cards are sold in randomly assorted packs and feature levels of rarity in accordance with their chances of appearing in a pack. As such, Magic cards can fetch anywhere from hundreds to tens of thousands of dollars on the secondary market, depending on their rarity. Notably, one of the rarest Magic cards, the Black Lotus, was sold on the secondary market in mid-2021 for $800,000. I guess I missed that. I mean, I remember a signed one going for $250,000. I don't remember one going for $800,000, but I guess it did. Throughout the relevant period, Hasbro's Magic business was a key area of focus for investors, increasingly due to concerns that the company was overprinting. And so here the plaintiffs are going back and they're underlining again that, hey, people on the conference calls were asking you guys, are you overprinting? We're worried about you overprinting. You know you're overprinting. And Chris Cox and Cynthia Williams and the rest of them would say, oh no, we're doing fine. We're giving the market exactly what it wants. Following defendants Cox's appointment as president of the company's Wizards segment in 2016, the company began to drive up the rate at which new Magic sets were released. As such, by 2020, the company released a greater number of sets than in any previous year and was able to double the revenue of the Wizards segment between 2018 and 2021. Additionally, the company occasionally released Magic sets containing reprints of previously released cards. However, reprinting Magic cards carries a direct risk of devaluing the existing cards held by players and collectors as the scarcity of such cards decreases. This concept was widely understood by Magic players and collectors, but not Timmy's, and served as a factor that could drive down consumer confidence and thus sales of Magic sets. So there he goes, laying out a lot of what I had here at the beginning of what the actual argument was. All of these things that go in a line to create this logical argument that he's trying to make to eventually establish culpability. This pattern continued following Defendant Williams' appointment as president of Wizards in February 22 to replace Defendant Cox after he was appointed CEO of the company. Under the direction of Defendant Williams, Wizards released a record 39 separate Magic sets in 2022. These sets were not limited to traditional expansion sets, but instead included box sets, compilation sets, supplemental sets, and digital sets. So, you know, this is one of those things where if you have a hearing in front of a judge, Wizards of the Coast lawyers are going to bring up that, hey, those 39 separate sets are not, they're not all equivalent. And they're going to try to explain that and mitigate their culpability by saying essentially a 5-card Secret Lair set is not equivalent to Baldur's Gate, which was a extra large set. As noted above, investors and analysts began to grow concerned about the potential that the company was overprinting Magic cards. And I highlighted it here because, again, this is that confusion in the proofreading where is the problem the overprinting of the cards or too many sets, and thus exceeding actual consumer demand? In response, the individual defendants defended the company's actions as conforming to its segmentation strategy. So when they were asked, is this a problem? Are you guys printing either too many sets or too many cards or both? They said, no, this is our strategy. According to the segmentation strategy, new Magic sets were only released to meet demand with regard to 4 categories of Magic consumers: collectors, competitive players, casual players, and players of the new online Magic Arena platform. Moreover, the individual defendants attempted to soothe investor and analyst concerns by reporting that its special 30th anniversary Magic set was out of stock within half an hour of its release, thus indirectly asserting that all of the Magic anniversary sets had been sold out. Market participants relayed the same information, with the publisher The Gamer issuing an article titled "Magic the Gathering 30th Anniversary Sells Out in Minutes." Okay, so they're using the existence of Magic 30 as something to say, look, these people were lying, we're going to prove they're lying, and we're going to show how we can prove that they're lying. We're going to bring the receipts and we're going to say Cynthia Williams knew on the day of the release of Magic 30 when it went on sale online, she knew within minutes that it was selling poorly and she gave the order for the sales to cease. So that is coming. Now we get into this upcoming section. The company utilized the revenue of Magic to account for revenue shortfall elsewhere in the company. And I've written here, this is motive. And so, you know, even though it's a civil complaint, you can have a motive for why someone did something. You know, if somebody drove their car through your living room and you need to sue them civilly, well, you can still have a motive for why they did it. And what the plaintiffs are doing here is trying to establish that there was a reason for them to release more and more sets and potentially to have overprinted those sets also. And the reason was they were having revenue shortfalls elsewhere in the company. And again, the low information people who just want to read a headline all kind of take this to misbelieve that this lawsuit is about Hasbro using its money from Magic to make up for other poor sales in the rest of the toy company. And that's not the case. What they're saying is that needing that money was the reason why they started overprinting, and then they lied about it. As noted above, the company's printing strategy for its Magic business resulted in significant short-term profits. These positive results coincided with increasingly poor results in the company's other businesses, namely its consumer product segment, which is toys. For instance, even as the consumer product segment reported weak sales and elevated inventory in 2022, the company's revenue derived solely from its Magic business exceeded $1 billion. Former employee 1 reported that the company began to overprint Magic cards in 2018 and noted that the reason for doing so was largely to account for poor financial performance in the company's other businesses. Former employee 1 stated that Wizards established specific Magic sets to be rapidly produced and released to generate roughly $40 and $80 million in the event of shortfalls in other company businesses. According to former employee 1, Bill Rose, the senior vice president for Magic, referred to the practice as Project Parachute, the parachute strategy. So the allegation they're making is that these secret layers would be produced, and what I mean is produced as in designed, not printed, but designed, all the packaging and everything, designed all of that, and the marketing materials. And then when they saw that a quarter was going to be short on the revenue targets because the toys were not selling, because all the Ahsoka action figures at Walmart were backing up to the ceiling, then they would release a couple more secret layers and juice the revenue by $40 or $80 million and make up the shortfall for the quarter. In order to account for shortfalls in other elements of the company's businesses, new Magic sets would thus be parachuted in to provide additional revenue. As such, the explosive growth in the Magic business noted just prior to and during the relevant period was in fact the result of the parachute strategy. Notably, in 2022, such parachute Magic sets accounted for 46% of all Magic releases. And I wish there was some kind of reference to that number to tell us where they got it. I mean, I'd be interested to know. Maybe it's part of exhibits in the class action lawsuit. Former employee 1 reported that in the early stages of the parachute strategy, most parachute sets were master sets, which consisted of reprinted cards and thus featured low production costs. Former employee 1 further stated that while master sets were sold prior to the parachute strategy, master sets sold under the parachute strategy were sold at higher prices. Prior to 2016, the company released only 2 physical master sets. However, between 2016 and 2023, the company released roughly double the number of master sets put out before 2016. And I put, would that be 3? Because if you had 2 before and then you roughly doubled, that sounds like lawyer speak for 3. You roughly doubled. If it were 4, you would have said doubled. And if it were 5, you would have said more than doubled. But if it's roughly doubled from 2, well, then it probably went up to 3, right? And in that time period, we would have had Double Masters 2022 and Commander Masters and Double Master, what did they call the one with the fat packs and the greenish boxes? I forget the name of it. But the one that came before Double Masters 22. And so wouldn't that have been 3? I just kind of pointed this out because it's funny how, like, you know, people will obscure, and by people here, I mean lawyers, will kind of try to obscure these things when the facts are not as strong as you would like them to be. And me as an engineer, I look at it and I immediately think, well, what is the number? Somebody's not just explicitly telling me the number. Why are they not just explicitly telling me this? What's the saying in law when the facts are on your side, pound the facts, and when the facts aren't on your side, pound the table? FE1 continued to report that while the parachute strategy was intended for use in the event that additional short-term revenue was required, the strategy was implemented on a much larger basis. And so then we get into secret layers, and that secret layers accounted for all this huge increase in the number of sets. Former employee 1 also stated that the Magic set known as Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate served as a parachute set for the company. Although most Magic sets are produced on a 2-year timeline, former employee 1 noted that the Baldur's Gate set was produced on a timeline of roughly 1 year, having been released in mid-2022. Former employee 2 reinforced former employee 1's observations, stating that sets such as Baldur's Gate, which were comprised of reprints, could be produced under rushed circumstances to supplement the company's short-term revenue. And right here, I'm going to call bullshit. I mean, that line is exactly wrong, because if you've been around Final Trade for a long time, you know that I opened over 200 draft boxes of Baldur's Gate to sell singles, and then I moved over to the collector boxes because, golly, there was a time period when you could open a collector box and make over $80 of profit on it, and if you were opening 36 collector boxes at a time, the economies of scale were amazing, and man, it was a great time for breaking boxes and selling singles. And so Baldur's Gate is the set from the last few years that I am the most familiar with. And when I read that line, Baldur's Gate, sets such as Baldur's Gate, which were comprised of reprints, I sat there and I said, Baldur's Gate is an IP tie-in set. How many reprints would it have had? And I know it had a couple that came in Adventures of the Forgotten Realms first, and then were reprinted in Baldur's Gate. There were at least a few. So I went out and I brought the receipts. I got actual data, like we do here on Final Trade. The main draftable part of Baldur's Gate was 361 cards, and only 52 of those were reprints. 309 of them were new cards. So this claim in the plaintiff's argument that Baldur's Gate, sets such as Baldur's Gate, which were comprised of reprints, could be produced under rush circumstances, that's not correct for Baldur's Gate. Baldur's Gate was vast majority new cards. So this is another one of those things, if you're gonna file your complaint, just come to Craig first. For only $300 an hour, I will review your complaint and show you the problems with it. Former employer 3 corroborated the account of 1 and 2 as he attended quarterly business review meetings with defendants Cox and other company executives. FE3 reported that during such meetings, he viewed presentation concerning Magic and the rate of Magic set releases. He noted that some of these meetings contained discussions pertaining to the parachute strategy. Now we get into a section about the company concealing the true reason for halting the sale of the Magic Anniversary set. And I wrote that I can't wait for discovery because if it survives motions to dismiss and it does not settle out of court and we actually get to discovery, we have a chance to get the real numbers for the sales of Magic 30, to get the actual number that were produced, the number that were sold, and the number that went to the landfill. So basically this section goes through and says that there was a war room and Cynthia Williams was there, and she would have known right away that Magic 30 was not selling, and the rest of the sets were dropped off at a Texas landfill. You guys remember that when the photos of all the Magic cards in the landfill came out? Oh man. And that the executives discussed the poor sales in meetings and were well aware of it, but then made false and misleading statements about it and other things on conference calls. Now, a lot of these false and misleading statements, I feel like are a bit weak. The relevant period began September 16th, 2021, when the company held the investor call. In attendance was Cox, who at the time served as the company as president of Wizards. During the call, the moderator asked him about the key drivers behind Magic's performance over the last couple of years. He replied by stating, "We've been driving our growth to date on kind of a play-based segmentation," and added that the segmentation strategy revolved around marketing products to 4 segments. He further stated that the strategy had really driven Magic's growth, and we see continuing to drive Magic's growth moving forward. Now, I read that and I'm like, wait, where's the false and misleading statement? I mean, it was their strategy to segment into 4 parts. They named the 4 parts. And then we, as people who have been in this ecosystem during this time period, we know they actually did that. They started designing products for collectors, for casual players, for competitive players, and for Arena. And so I'm not sure what about this is false or misleading. The moderator also asked him, should we expect a more regular cadence of Magic card releases going forward? He responded by emphasizing thinking about the customers and what they want, and then explained that Magic was not trying to build one product for one customer that has to buy everything, because the real growth and the real driver for us has been thinking about things on a segmented basis. So again, and this goes along with, and I, at risk of naming the wrong person, was it Gavin Varys? Or, yeah, was it was it he who had that famous line where he said, if you're not interested in the product, don't interact with it, or something like that? But I mean, it was this time period when, yeah, that was their policy. They were trying to engage different types of buyers in different ways with different products. So again, I'm a little confused here on what the false and misleading part of this is. Later on during the September 21 investor call, Cox listed examples of products the company released in connection with the segmentation strategy, stating that we've done new things like our secret layer card drops for the collector segment. So again, what is false and misleading there? On November 11th, they have the Jefferies Global Interactive Entertainment Conference, and he was a speaker at that. And he was asked to talk a little bit about how the Hasbro brand blueprint allows Magic to experience that explosive growth. In response, Cox stated that we drove all new segmentation for how we think about our product lines. Again, false and misleading. I don't really know, what am I missing here that's supposed to be so false and misleading? Because he's basically reiterating what they have said the strategy was, and then what, from our memory, we remember them executing as the strategy. October 18th, 2022, so about a year later, the company hosted an earnings call to discuss results of the third quarter with investors. During the call, an analyst asked the following question: there's been some investor concern that there's maybe been too many Magic releases in a short time frame. There's some talk of wallet fatigue among players out there. We've seen the secondary market prices come down a bit. So I'm curious, just what's your response to that concern that there's just a lot of Magic product coming all at once? To which Williams responded by stating, you've got the same number of sets happening in a year in the hobby channel. Okay. I mean, it's a crappy answer that just deflects the question. But is it false or misleading, right? So what she's saying is that in the hobby channel, whatever Hasbro defines their hobby channel as, I'm not sure what products they have there. Like, do they make model kits or something? And she's saying we have the same number of releases over there. And so she's just saying that the number of releases is not a problem, that it's typical. We can argue over whether or not it is, but does it rise to the level of a false or misleading statement? That's why I feel this section of the complaint is pretty weak. And then pertaining to the Magic Anniversary set release, they released the set. Within approximately 30 minutes of the release, a message was posted to the release website stating it was out of stock. These statements described in these previous paragraphs were materially false and or misleading when made because they failed to disclose that Hasbro's strategy with regard to printing Magic cards was not as carefully thought out as portrayed. The company was in fact printing a volume of Magic sets, which exceeded consumer demand. The company's inventory allocation management was problematic, particularly as it pertained to the company's printing strategy for Magic sets. The company was overloading the market with Magic sets to generate revenue and to offset shortfalls within the company. As a result of the company's overprinting of Magic sets, existing Magic cards were devalued, and the company failed to maintain internal controls. As a result of the foregoing, the company's public statements were materially false and misleading at all relevant times. So maybe I lack the experience because I am not a lawyer, and so maybe this whole argument is wasted on me, but quoting several things from the conference calls that do actually appear to be correct statements, or in the case of this one, are just irrelevant to the question that was asked, doesn't, to me, rise to the level of false and misleading. So the truth begins to emerge as the false and misleading statements continue. So it goes through an article that was published talking about the number of sets being released and the Bank of America report. So this was a report that came out in 2022, I believe, and it was this big report about it's destroying the long-term value of the brand, that they're overprinting, there's too many sets, and that players are growing frustrated. Local stores are losing money, collectors and distributors are losing money because there's just too much product in the system. It can't absorb it all, and they're having to blow it out below cost in order to get rid of it and recoup something. And actually in here, somewhere around here, they actually reference Amazon dumps, which I thought was great. Wizards has printed and released more of both their most popular set releases through third-party distributors and less popular ones through product dumps on Amazon. Yeah. 7 of the past 8 major set releases have seen price decline from their initial levels. And let's see, what was the exact date on this report? November 14th of 2022. So remember when Double Masters 22 came out over the summer before this? Its release week price for the collector box was $280. And at the low, we were buying them for something like $160 or $170. So it was in the time period when Double Masters had just absolutely cratered in price. And it really was the darkest time, because you'll remember they slashed the print runs by the beginning of 2023. And so this report came out right at the worst time. By the beginning of 23, print runs were slashed, and by Black Friday of 23, the market financially finally bottomed. And so it goes through more of the Bank of America analysis, and then the December 8th, 2022 Hasbro special call, which again, I believe is the fireside chat. The company hosted a special call with investors and analysts to discuss the Bank of America report and the Magic Anniversary set. The call being explicitly focused on Magic and Hasbro's long-term strategy for its gaming business. During the call, UBS analyst asked Defendant Williams the following questions. If it isn't price, are you releasing then more product this year? Could you sort of go through pillars of growth for Magic? Defendant Williams responded that our growth is coming from both our customer and product segmentation strategy. And as a result, we're serving more player segments than ever before. And so that's going to shift how many SKUs we release this year, in a year. Our growth has come from monetizing more player segments and not just from increasing the spend of the same core set of players, and our product release schedule really reflects that. And so I feel like this is kind of distracting to the plaintiff's argument. It's Williams saying, hey, yeah, this is the strategy that we took on. And like I've said before in this video, we saw them then execute that strategy. So I'm not really sure what the plaintiffs are going for here, except to say Williams was completely aware that the segmentation and releasing lots of sets was the plan. And here she is admitting yet again that it's the plan to release a whole lot of sets. Maybe you have to really hammer that point home and build it up in this long argument that eventually gets, let's see, the sets, too many sets. And so maybe it's just that they're trying to hammer this pillar of the argument even harder, to say, hey, this is Williams once again saying that they've tripled or come close to triple Magic's overall business, and they did it by releasing so many new sets. It's about leaning into our segmentation strategy. Later on during the call, Defendant Williams was asked to answer the claim that you're printing too many cards. Williams replied that there is no evidence that Magic is overprinted. I remember that day. I remember when that quote came out of the fireside chat, and we just all laughed and laughed as we looked at all the draft boxes of expansions that had come out since Kaldheim, since, golly, even before that, Zendikar Rising. God, that was one of the worst ones. So Zendikar Rising in late 2020, all the way through 21, Strixhaven, AFR, Crimson Vow, Midnight Hunt, MH2, and then into 2022, man, all the things that have been just crazy overprinted in that whole period. And then for Cynthia Williams to sit there at the end of 2022 when Double Masters 22 collector boxes had lost 40% of their value, and she says there's no evidence that Magic is overprinted. It was the most corporate speak moment I've maybe ever seen. A UBS analyst noted that there's been some chatter that secondary market card values are coming down because you're printing too much. Is that something you keep track of? Is that something that concerns you? Williams replied by stating, we print and reprint products to meet demand from our players. And, I mean, that is honest. they look out at the secondary market, they see the reprint equity to be harvested, which is reflective of the demand of the players. The reprint equity is high because the players demand those cards in excess of what the market is currently providing, and so WOTC reprints them. Defendant Williams stated that during the year, Wizards had expanded the number of booster product types and smaller print run products released to meet player preferences. Yeah, I mean, they were certainly trying that. We all have our opinions over how successful Secret Lair has been, and some of them have been more successful than others. Defendant Williams spoke about Magic Anniversary Set, stating that sometimes we step back and look to customer feedback like we did on our recent 30th anniversary edition, where we scaled back the expected supply to ensure a great collector experience. In other words, we didn't want the product absolutely cratering in the secondary market and revealing how unpopular it was, and so we cut off the sales early. And so then it just goes through again, claiming those are false and misleading statements. January 26 earnings call. Let's see, year-over-year fourth quarter revenue growth had fallen substantially short of analysts' expectations. Press release quoted Defendant Cox as stating the company's consumer products segment had underperformed. The press release also revealed that the company would be eliminating 15% of its workforce, and the stock price fell. April 27th of 23, still within the relevant period. During the call, Cox discussed elevated inventory levels, stating our owned inventory is up a bit, but most of that has to do with kind of the nature of Wizards production. Deborah Thomas, the company's chief financial officer, stated that higher Wizards of the Coast inventories were due to the timing of Magic releases this year. And that's what I was talking about earlier, that just depending on when the releases are, they can be sitting on those boxes right when the snapshot for the quarterly report is taken, including the March of the Machines release in mid-April and Lord of the Rings Tale of Middle-earth slightly before Q3. This is the only place that Universes Beyond appears in the complaint. So no, it is not a lawsuit about Universes Beyond. So then we get to the May 3rd, 2023 Form 10-Q, which is a quarterly filing that companies make with the SEC. And in it, it stated that the increase in Hasbro's inventories during the first quarter of 23 was driven primarily by higher inventory balances within the Wizards of the Coast and digital gaming segment, most notably in anticipation of several upcoming Magic the Gathering set releases, which, duh. Of course, if you're going to have several upcoming releases, you're carrying more inventory going into those releases. Again, I don't understand why the people who drafted this complaint chose to bold that and italicize it as if this is some like big winning statement that proves their point. Like, this is how the business cadence of Magic works. They get the sets printed, typically a couple of months early, and then they have to sit on them a little while before they send them to the distributor to send them on to card stores at release. So I don't know why this is emphasized so heavily. I don't know if it's because the lawyers who drafted this complaint aren't experts on this stuff, or because the complaint is weak and kind of convoluted to start with, and so they're just kind of trying to throw more stuff at the wall and see if it sticks. The truth emerges. October 26 press release and earnings call. The truth finally emerged before the market opened when Hasbro issued a press release. The company had reduced their owned inventory by 27% company-wide, but the consumer product inventories decreased by 34%. As noted above, given that Wizards was the only other company segment which possessed inventory, by virtue of mathematics, the Wizards segment had less inventory improvement as compared to the company as a whole. Okay, so it had less inventory improvement, but it still improved. They still managed to cut inventory. And I remember in this time period when the quarterly reports would come out, and there was a lot of concern about how much inventory they were holding because they had printed too much in 21 and 22. And I'll tell you, there are some 2022 sets that are still available from distribution today. That's how much they overprinted. So that same day, the company hosted the conference call, the earnings call, Gina Goder, the company's CFO, stated that the reduction in total owned inventory was primarily driven by non-Wizards inventory. Yeah, okay. It cut its guidance for the year, announcing a $50 million one-time cost to move through inventory, including extra marketing and extra obsolescence costs. So what that would have been is they would have taken a hit to the revenue as a cost in order to move the inventory to distribution at a lower than normal price, or they would have offered incentives such as manufacturer rebates, those kind of things, or these extra obsolescence costs would have been the cost of shipping it to the landfill, and the extra marketing would have been, hey, let's market this a little heavier and see if we can gin up some more interest in buying these products that have been sitting in our warehouse for so long. So they were saying that they were taking on a one-time cost of $50 million in order to do those things to try to move that inventory. On this news, the share price fell. So now we get into what the plaintiffs claim are the actual damage that was suffered from all this stuff, all this supposed collusion around having this strategy, it being executed poorly, the results being bad, and then essentially covering up and lying about the results until you couldn't levitate anymore and you came back down to earth in October of 23. So during the period, the company repurchased a bunch of stock for approximately $125 million. And I hate to say it, but, you know, this is a lot of Timmy thinking here that, hey, if only they had bought that stock on a different day at a lower price, they would have saved a lot of money. You know, that's how a lot of Timmys think about investing, about TCG investing, about stock investing. And that's the argument they're making here, is that if Hasbro had bought at the real value of the company, which is what it came down to after here, it came down to $45.84 on October 27, 2023, after this bad press release the day before. If only they had bought all that stock, all the buybacks they did during the relevant period, at that price, they would have saved all this money. And certainly it is an argument you can make. I don't think it's a great argument, but, you know, when it comes to lawsuits, you don't have to be right. You just have to convince the court or the jury. So it says individual defendants had knowledge. The internal company metrics showed that they were overprinting Magic cards. And then we get into a bunch of employee testimony from these former employees, which I assume are related to the other class action lawsuit. And so they recounted that Cox and Williams both knew about the parachute strategy. They both talked about it. They both sat in on meetings where it was discussed, where it was in presentations. They knew that it was happening and that it was being used to essentially make up for gaps in revenue from the rest of the business. Former employee 4 also reported that during the meetings he attended, the participants discussed the conclusion that the company's overprinting of Magic cards directly resulted in the declining demand for Magic products. And that's the crux of the argument that the plaintiffs are making, is that overprinting leads to devaluation of the cards, leads to a lowering of people's collection value, leads to a loss of confidence, leads to fewer sales, leads to a lower stock price. So when you have a very, very, very long chain argument like this in a lawsuit, it means you have to put forth a lot of information in order to support every piece of that chain. Because what's going to happen is WOTC is going to file a motion to dismiss, and they're going to come into here and they're going to attack every one of these links, hoping that the judge presiding over the case says, you know, this one or that one. Yeah, I don't think that one's right. Therefore, the whole chain breaks. Former employee 1 reported that when the Bank of America report was published, company employees who were aware of the parachute strategy acknowledged the report's veracity. The publication on November 14, 2022, FE1 stated that company employees ranging from the line staff to the directors had made comments noting that Bank of America was correct in their reporting. Oh, man. And then just more corroboration regarding the Magic anniversary set FE1 reported that individual defendants were aware that the set was not out of stock due to being sold out, but rather due to being pulled for poor performance. And then, let's see, individual defendants routinely reviewed the company's financial statements and the company's Magic business. I assume all the redactions are because it contains financial information of the company that are not public. My daughter came to me and said, "Daddy, it's just printing black bars. Something's wrong." Damages to Hasbro as a direct and proximate result of the individual defendant's conduct, Hasbro has lost and expended and will continue to lose and expend many millions of dollars. All right. I put that's a tough hill to climb because you're going to have to show that these actions cause the loss of millions of dollars and will continue to cause the loss. So you're going to have to meet some standard of evidence that shows when you make that argument that it holds tight and that the company has lost and will continue to lose millions of dollars. That's going to be very difficult in light of the fact that the relevant period of this lawsuit is August of 21 to September of 23. And now here we are sitting at the beginning of 26 and Final Fantasy is the first, was it the first? It wasn't the first $1 billion. No, it wasn't $1 billion product on its own, but it was the best selling product of all time for Magic. And then the next thing was the best selling. The next thing's the best selling. And the sales of Magic are off the charts. So it's going to be really hard to say that this strategy caused the loss of millions of dollars and will continue to cause the company to lose millions of dollars when they're simply going to say, look, line go up. So then the complaint reiterates the $55.9 million that the company lost by not having a magic ball that told them what day in the future to buy stock on, and that you'll have a whole bunch of other legal and investigatory costs having to do with these kind of lawsuits. Let's see. The board are the defendants, and so the demand futility allegation. So this is interesting, something I had not been familiar with before, but it's basically saying that because the board is the one who has done the things that we allege are bad, we cannot make demands that they now do the right thing. We can't rely on them to be good stewards going forward. And so we can't ask them to do, basically to make this right, because they were the ones who acted badly in the first place. Here we have another mention of overprinting of Magic sets, and it goes through, and thus demand upon her is futile and therefore excused. And so it goes through each person and explains why the demand on them is futile and excused. Let's see, what was my thought about this? Oh, additional reasons that demand on the board is futile follow, and that is redacted. That'd be interesting to know. That one's actually one I'm interested in knowing. Extra defendants on the audit committee and why they are excused. Breach of duty and candor, violation of code of conduct. Demand is excused as being futile. All right, here we go. What are the actual claims against the individual defendants for violations of Sections 20A of the Security Exchange Act? These are things we claim that they broke the law on, but remember, this is still a civil lawsuit. Plaintiffs on behalf of Hasbro have no adequate remedy at law. So what that means is that the things that they allege the defendants have done that are bad cannot be undone simply by paying money. Basically, that the loss of goodwill or the loss of opportunity or something else has conspired in such a way that they cannot be made whole simply by getting money from Hasbro. Something else has to be done. And so it makes additional claims and basically rounds up each one by saying that saying the same thing. Plaintiffs on behalf of Hasbro have no adequate remedy at law. There is no monetary damage they can pay us to make us whole for these bad things they've done. No adequate remedy at law, no adequate remedy. Fifth claim against individual defendants for waste of corporate assets, no adequate remedy. Against defendants for gross mismanagement, no adequate remedy. Against individual defendants for abuse of control, no adequate remedy. Eventually he gets the one where he says he has a remedy. against Cox and Williams for contribution under Sections 10B and 21D of the Exchange Act. As such, Hasbro is entitled to receive all appropriate contribution or indemnification from defendants Cox and Williams. Okay, so let's see. Is this where they're going back? Positions of control and authority. Yes. So here's where I had kind of alluded to earlier, because of the potential outcome of the securities class action, which is the separate lawsuit, that essentially the company is in danger, because the outcome of that could be a whole lot of money Hasbro has to pay out. And they're saying Hasbro is entitled to receive all appropriate contribution or indemnification from Cox and Williams. So things that they did wrong that caused that other class action suit that these plaintiffs think Hasbro is going to lose and lose a lot of money for, we think that Cox and Williams should be personally liable for that. And so that's what they're saying they want, which is interesting, because you come through this whole thing, 73 pages of this so far, and we get to here and we see, oh, this is what they're really asking for. This is what the lawsuit is actually about. It's about indemnifying Hasbro against the outcome of this class action lawsuit. Interesting, eh? You had to read through 73 pages to get to it. Prayer for relief. So let's see. Plaintiffs may maintain this action on behalf of Hasbro. That plaintiffs are an adequate representative of the company. Again, this goes back to the arguments about the board cannot be relied upon to maintain this complaint, because the board are the ones that this complaint is leveled against. Declaring that each of the individual defendants have breached or aided and abetted the breach of their fiduciary duties. Let's see. And then they say that basically they want people to act better and follow their bylaws and all of their corporate rules, and propose to strengthen the board's supervision. And then they want a provision to permit the shareholders to nominate at least 5 candidates for election to the board, ensure the establishment of effective oversight, awarding Hasbro restitution from individual defendants, and each of them awarding plaintiffs the costs and granting such other and further relief as the court may deem just and proper. Okay? And then you have the two plaintiffs both saying, yes, all of this is true. We verify. But here it is, guys. Here is the actual... This is the core of it. They're looking for indemnification from Cox and Williams if this other class action lawsuit goes sideways and ends up getting ruled against Hasbro. They want Cox and Williams to be the ones personally liable, or liable through their insurers, for it, and not Hasbro itself. So there it is. That's what this lawsuit is about. Let me know what you think, guys.